100 bodies have piled up at the mortuary in Hillbrow waiting for post-mortems. But that is not the only mortuary in South Africa where there is a crisis. We speak to the Democratic Alliance's Shadow Minister for Health, Michele Clarke. Welcome, Michele.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning to your viewers, and thank you for having me on your show.
Michele, can you give us an overview of what is happening at the 136 mortuaries that are under state control?
Okay, so the situation in terms of state mortuaries is really dismal and really needs urgent attention. So there are bodies piling up in each and every mortuary. For instance, in the Hillbrow Mortuary, you've got over 100 bodies that they still have to do post-mortems on. We have a severe shortage of pathologists in the state, and pathologists within the state also moonlight doing extra work in the private sector. So that also causes a huge problem because they're not really focusing solely on what needs to be done within our state mortuaries. The power outages and the issues around Eskom has also had a huge implication at our mortuaries, because often some of our mortuaries do not have generators. And I think that is something that we need to seriously be looking at to exempt mortuaries from being load shedded, because that causes a massive problem as well. So in many instances, there's been reported that there are being bribes solicited, and through bribes being solicited, what they would do is, if your family's body has been there for a time period, if you pay a bribe, they would see to your family's bodies first to bodies that have come into the mortuary prior to that. So that also is a massive problem. And I think the issue around mortuaries is that there is no legislation that actually regulates mortuaries. And in terms of that issue, I think it's really a need for legislation to be amended and a PMB brought to Parliament in order to look at how we're going to regulate mortuaries, number one. And secondly, there's a big need to establish an ombudsman in order to deal with the issues with the state mortuaries. And once you've got an ombudsman in place, they do investigations and they will give recommendations in terms of their findings. And that gives you a very good guideline to actually go to mortuaries on the ground to see that these recommendations are being implemented. But it's also very necessary for the state to partner with private companies, because they quite clearly cannot cope with what is needed. And if they form private-public partnerships with private mortuaries to address these backlogs, that would be a great outcome.
Talking about bribery, we've had reports that some family members have had to bribe mortuary officials just to view the bodies of their loved ones.
Yes, we've also had reports regarding that. And what I am doing is submitting parliamentary questions through the parliamentary process to find out if any officials have been reprimanded or if they have any proof of these bribes, and if any consequence management has been put in place to deal with this issue, and what were the outcomes of the investigations, and whether any of these officials have been suspended for bribery and corruption, and if there's ongoing investigations around these cases. Now, what should be happening is, bodies should not be in a mortuary longer than 10 days, and then they need to be released for burial. And this is not happening. I mean, by the time people receive their loved ones to do their funerals, the bodies have been totally decomposed and very often not even recognized. And that kind of inhumane behavior towards someone that has lost someone that is a loved one to themselves is extremely traumatic. And, government need to take cognizance of that. You cannot allow for this to happen. It's a very emotional aspect that people must deal with, firstly with the death, and then not recognizing the bodies because they've been so badly decomposed.
We've also had reports of unqualified people working on bodies and leaving them unrecognizable.
Correct. There's also been many reports around that. And that basis will also form part of our questions to Parliament in terms of the investigations. And what we normally do is once we receive the answers of those questions, we actually go on the ground to check whether the information that has been given to us from various spheres of government, because remember, local government, provincial government, and COCTA within Parliament also play roles, as well as the health department, in terms of all the aspects of mortuaries. So we go on the ground and see whether these answers we've received from the Minister's office is actually valid and true. And if not, we then continue with further investigations, and very often if there's huge issues around bribery and corruption and they haven't dealt with it, we would refer the issue to the SIU in order to investigate these matters.
With the Thabo Bester case, the entire country now knows that a body can go missing from a mortuary. And we have had reports not only of bodies disappearing, but of body parts apparently being sold for the purposes of muti. What have you heard?
Yes, that's a very big concern. And if that is happening within our mortuaries, as I say, the only way to really deal with this is to ensure that you have an ombudsman that can ensure that he does those investigations and gives us a report. And of course, that kind of behavior also stems from bribery and corruption. So of course, and this continuous unabated practice within government, it's not just within mortuaries, it's happening in all the hospitals, it's happening in every sphere of government, in every department of government. And, it is our jobs, and in particularly the opposition, we really try and keep an eye on these issues. The only concern we always have is, obviously, if you submit a piece of legislation to Parliament and make really good recommendations to improve the system, the ANC is always inclined to not vote on our proposed legislation. And of course, that becomes a problem to us. I mean, we often say to them, you can put it in your name as long as, we can get this through, because it improves service delivery and the quality of people's lives. But that's a big problem. As soon as, you put good legislation, good recommendations forward to be taken into account, there's always a case that they will vote against that. Hopefully, in the 2024 elections, we see some change.
Now, obviously, this has an effect on the justice system, because if post-mortem reports are written by somebody who is not qualified, that affects the quality of testimony in the courtroom. If DNA results don't become available, cases can't be prosecuted.
Absolutely. It's a huge problem because, already we are facing an issue around our justice system, and which is very worrying. I mean, we've just seen what happened with the Thabo Bester case. And, those aspects are extremely worrying. So there's a couple of factors here, so justice, police, health, within Parliament and COCTA, and I'm talking about national level, should collaborate together to improve this issue that's going on. I can say to you that I've also been to various hospitals for oversight, and the mortuaries within the hospitals are also a problem. There's terrible stench around it, and because fridges don't work properly, etc., It's terrible. I mean, we did an oversight in the Eastern Cape, and we found, those aspects. And you often find that the mortuaries in the hospitals themselves aren't functioning properly because they don't necessarily have the correct resources. They have had no maintenance in terms of their fridges, and they just don't have the operational needs within their mortuaries to deal with what they need to deal with.
So it's been put to me that there's an urgent need to transfer responsibility for the mortuaries to an independent, state-funded forensic services body. How can that be done?
I agree 100%, but obviously that's got to be done through legislation, and that legislation needs to come to Parliament to be passed in order to reach that outcome, because there's certain aspects in terms of policy that would have to change, and there would be various role players involved, as I mentioned before, in order to collaborate to make sure that those changes are made within legislation, and that there is a ring-fenced system through National Treasury that can reach those outcomes as well in terms of funding.
Thank you. That was the Democratic Alliance's Shadow Minister for Health, Michele Clarke, speaking to BizNews about the horrific state of South Africa's state-controlled mortuaries and telling us what should be done to bring the situation under control. Thank you, Michele.
Thank you very much.